Good morning, Anchor Church. I am so excited that we are still in our teaching series Against the Grain. Don't you think it's rather fitting as we're in the middle of election season, a global pandemic, rampant racial injustice? There is a lot going on right now. And for many of us, we have developed maybe some practices that have helped keep us grounded during this time to really stay rooted as the world just changes at rapid speed, because it's hard to keep up, isn't it? Now, I'm not talking about your Netflix binges. I'm not talking about your kettle chip consumption, although if it was a competition, I'd win. Whatever, it's fine. I'm not talking more recently about your Hamilton replays, which are happening a lot in my household. Now, I'm not talking about mere consumption. More than transaction, perhaps something more transcendent, more transformational. Maybe you've gone on a walk, just you and the Lord. You had time to process what's going on, bring your burdens before Him. Maybe you've meditated on Scripture like you've never have before, really dug into His Word and you've let it simmer in your spirit. Or maybe you've made it a practice to have virtual touch points with the people that you can share your life with, your highs and your lows. You know, over time, these practices become so ingrained into our identity, deeply impressed on our mind, body, and our soul. And you know what? Over time, they can often be what we're known for, our trademark, if you will. Today, we're going to look at Daniel. And as we look at Daniel's practice of prayer, how it radically altered his life, may we glean from his experience, from his writings, so we can be imperfect Jesus followers, living for the good, just as Daniel was. Now, few things to know as we talk about Daniel. We're going to really be in Daniel 6 today. But before that, I want to just remind you, and Matt really kicked us off in Daniel last week so well, is that he was an exile in Babylon. He was a noble Israelite, and the conquering power saw that he had some leadership abilities. They saw that he was a pretty sharp guy. They renamed him Belteshazzar to closely identify him with his new people group. They wanted to change his identity. They introduced him to new gods. You know, Daniel was in Babylon for the full 70-year captivity. And over time, his leadership, his kindness, his grace, his vision, his dream interpretation, his writing, all of that afforded him privileged position. And when we dive into Daniel 6, we see that he is one of 3 administrators over all of Babylon. He is an important guy. He's got a lot on his plate. He's got a lot of power. He's got a lot of access to power. And you can see that he is serving the Lord faithfully in a land and culture that's not his own. Also, Daniel, by the time we see him in chapter 6, he is pushing 90. Again, he's serving his 3rd king. He's been there for a hot minute. Let's read. Daniel 6, starting in verse 1. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, "Long live King Darius. We are all in agreement. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions." Interesting to note that they just had that on tap, by the way. Verse 8, "And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked." So King Darius signed the law. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Now, the officials caught Daniel in the act. They caught him praying to his God. And I just think it's so beautiful that right when that document had been signed, the first thing we see, verse 10, the first thing we see, he knew the law and he went home. Not to pray to King Darius, but to pray to his God. Isn't it wild that the officials knew Daniel's practices? His practice of prayer was so well known that's really the only way they knew they could catch him, that they could squelch his chances of advancement. I mean, he is on the brink of a promotion to be the ruler over all of Persia. And he knows the law, and he bends his knee toward the true sovereign anyway. You know, even if we have a very successful future in front of us, how powerful to look at Daniel and look at his allegiance and his obedience and his faithfulness to his king. His convictions outweighed his loyalty to the system he was in. His practice of prayer in that moment was an act of civil disobedience, a peaceful form of protest. Now, interestingly, the practice of prayer for the Israelites was inconceivable apart from Israel, apart from the temple. So here is Daniel. Honestly, he's getting pretty creative in his time and place. And in Jewish prayer, it was not customary to bow. Yet we see this honor of Daniel bowing before the true king, not King Darius, but the king of all. And just so we're sure, just so we know, we don't see any derision between Daniel and King Darius. We don't see that there's any division or discord at all. In fact, the reason Daniel had so much favor is because he was so good at his job. He was so trustworthy. Remember, the scripture said trustworthy. King Darius was pleased with Daniel. And Daniel cared most about pleasing God. Now, the practice of prayer toward Jerusalem is acknowledged to have risen in Babylon during captivity. Now, King Solomon, when he dedicated the temple, he had contingency for captivity. 1 Kings 8:48-49 says, "If they turn to you with their whole heart and soul in the land of their enemies and pray toward the land you gave to their ancestors, toward this city you have chosen, and toward this temple I have built to honor your name, then hear their prayers and their petition from heaven where you live and uphold their cause." This is why he orients his body toward Jerusalem. It's a longing for the way things used to be, a longing for his normal of what's right. He's echoing Solomon's hopes that God would hear him. You know, in Psalm 37, we see a captive taken to Babylon and this poetic lament of what he experienced. And it says this in Psalm 37, "Beside the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we thought of Jerusalem. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees. For our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. Sing us one of those songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? The psalmist raises a significant question. How do we sing an honest song before the Lord when we find ourselves as the minority in a land that is so foreign to us? Now, the Old Testament gives us beautiful examples of how to live in a foreign land and still remain fully devoted to God. We see Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and of course, our guy Daniel. And when Daniel is in Babylon, we see that it is just by his own writings how idolatrous it was. How it was so different than home. Could you even imagine? As an exile, you didn't choose this. You didn't choose to be there. You've lost so much, your place and your space, everything that's precious to you. I can identify, how could we sing that song, the psalmist says. And we have documentary evidence to show that many Israelites, they assimilated into that Babylonian culture. They engaged in commerce. Scholars say that they added Yahweh to the list of Babylonian gods. They eased in pretty well. And over time, many of them forgot Jerusalem, but not Daniel. He didn't. He stayed faithful. You know, when I was in high school, the tagline of the youth ministry I was in was "Start young, never quit." Now, in full disclosure, I do not remember the actual name of the youth ministry because it changed so many times. But the tagline didn't. It really stuck. And the practices I learned in my youth, meditation, compassionate action that leads to justice, generosity, living simply, communing with the Lord, sharing my burdens, and active confession, they're practices that I practice today. And it's been far too many years. I will not reveal my age, but it's been a minute since I've been in youth group. But those practices, they have woven themselves into the very fiber of my being. And I feel most like myself as the woman God created me to be when I'm in those rhythms, when I'm in those practices. Now, as we live in a type of Babylon here in this present day, in this cultural moment, we can lean on and dive deeper, deepen those practices that we know lead us closer to our King, our true sovereign. And as we do, we see that it transforms our identity. It becomes what we're known for. And like Daniel, because we refuse to throw away those practices, we stay consistent, we see that we can be a blessing to the people and the place around us, just like Daniel. The need to be diligent in these practices is more pertinent than ever before. I think the stakes are very high, and I think you probably agree with me. These are crazy times. I mean, on New Year's Eve, did you think that this would be your July, your August, your September? Did you think that this would be your life? I don't think many of us did. But the one thing that we can practice, regardless how everything is changing so quickly around us, are these practices. Ones that really will keep us grounded, especially as the toxicity of social media is just this clanging noise, what we're reading, election season, the craziness of that, all of it. The practices keep us grounded. So what practices deepen our identity in the true sovereign? I think there's 3 practices as a church family that we can practice together. The first is this: like Daniel, we can be faithful to come to the Lord in prayer, to come to him, to commune with him day in and day out. He's so faithful a friend, ready and waiting. You know, he doesn't get tired of us bringing our burdens, our woes to him, he can handle it. He's ready and waiting. We can remember who we are, our identity, when we spend time with him. As his image bearers, it's a beautiful thing to spend time with our Creator. You know, right now, he needs our ultimate allegiance, not the powerful of this world, maybe not our preferred politicians, but the true sovereign, our King. Next, we confess where we've got it wrong. I don't think there's ever been a better time to renounce what is not of God, to renounce where you've got it wrong. Maybe practices, sin, ideology that has harmed or demeaned others, or that's harmed or demeaned yourself, that has cut off trust and connection with the Lord. One of the ways I really practice this in my life is with my kids. Not only do I want to model this for them, I'm doing this for my own well-being. It's not uncommon for my kids to hear me confess my sin to them. I am so sorry how mommy talked to you today. I am so sorry that I cut you off when you were in the middle of a sentence. I am so sorry that I didn't hear where you're coming from. Would you forgive me? That practice of confession, when that becomes normal, when that practice of confession becomes our everyday, which I understand takes a heavy dose of humility, I think it really keeps us from falling prey to deception, thinking that everything should be the way we think it should be. We're right, nothing's wrong, we have nothing to confess. No. Search us, oh God. That's why I brought prayer up first. We can commune with him, let him see, let him dig deep, let him bring to the surface things that are not for us anymore, to confess and to lay down. And as we do that, again, that practice as it happens over time, day to day, week to week, year to year, think of the person you're becoming. That's not a person who is easily deceived. Confessing what is not of God, confessing what is not of the scriptures, confessing what is sin in your life that needs to be ripped out. Makes way for lament, makes way for new vision, for redemption, for reconciliation. Psalm 32, 3-5 says, "My bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of the summer." That's a word right now, isn't it? Verse 5, "Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." See the beauty of what happens when we confess. The forgiveness, the restoration. It's beautiful. It connects us with God and others. Another practice is to pray with our feet, to pray with our arms, to pray with our shouts. This has been very evident as men and women of all ethnicities have stood in solidarity for Black lives, believing that they are created in the image of God and deserve equal treatment, deserve justice, deserve the same good things that everyone would want for their family. And one of the things that have always really embodied this for me is a story from 2015. Maybe you saw it in the news. But in 2015, Bree Newsom Bass climbed a 30-foot flagpole on the South Carolina State House grounds. And she grabbed the Confederate flag and said, "You come against me with hatred, oppression, and violence, and I come at you in the name of God. This flag comes down today." She ripped it down, went back down that flagpole. And as she was arrested, she could be heard reciting Psalm 27. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" You know, that flagpole went up about 45 minutes later. But then about a month later, it came down for good because of her act of civil disobedience because of her act, her practice of her faith. In fact, when she was interviewed by a major news outlet, they said, "Why were you reciting scripture when you were read your rights?" And she said, "It's a practice of my faith." Now, I am all for meditating scripture with a cup of coffee first thing in the morning in my jam, sitting on my couch with a fur blanket. Like, come on, I am for that. But sometimes meditation and the action, the outpouring, the overflow of what is happening in our souls looks like scaling a flagpole to tear down a symbol of hatred, oppression, and violence. How beautiful when our actions lead to justice that reflects the gospel. You know, the person we become when we make it a practice to commune with the Lord, to confess where we've got it wrong, and to pray with our arms, with our feet, with our shouts, is somebody that is going to bring heaven to earth. It's somebody that is going to expose Jesus wherever they go, just like Daniel did. It's going to be someone who is so well known for their commitment to their God, just like Daniel was. Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre talks about practices having an inherent goal within them. So for us, these practices invite us to root our identity, transform our identity to look like Christ, to go against the grain. Really, it's an act of resistance. Resistance against the ways of this world, of what's acceptable, of what's necessary, of what's in vogue. So the question here is, what practices are you doing? It's not what practices are you doing, but which ones are molding you? Tomorrow, Monday morning, how do these practices lead you closer into the fullness of God, exposing his love, his beauty, and his justice to the world? That's going against the grain. One of my favorite early Christian writings says this: Christians live in their own countries, but only as guests and aliens. They take part in everything as citizens and endure everything as aliens. They are poor as beggars, and yet they make many rich. They lack everything, and yet they have everything in abundance. They are dishonored, and yet they have their glory in this very dishonor. They are abused, yet they bless the world. In a word, what the soul is in the body, the Christians are in the world. As you look at your life, as you think of the practices that are molding you, I pray that we would be that soul in the world as we deepen and root our identity in the true sovereign.